Morning, everyone. Welcome to another Remco forum event or another forum event at the IoDSA. We welcome everyone. I'm seeing from the chat, we're getting everyone in from Joburg, Centurion. Hello, everyone. Hello, hello, hello. I'm sure there's going to be a few more, someone from Shwani. So welcome, everyone. I'm glad you can join us. It is nice and cold in Johannesburg or Gauteng. I'm sure it is cold everywhere else too, but we are really feeling the chill here. We have a fantastic weather in Joburg, so it's quite chilly. So we have a great topic today. Again, we are presenting today a paper that has been published from our Remuneration Committee forum. As you know, there's great thought leadership coming out of our Remco forum. We're very proud of the work that comes out of this forum. It is very informative and it provides great guidance. The paper today is the Principal, Agent Problems and Executive Remuneration. We've got a panel of experts. I'd like to add that all our panel members serve on our Remuneration Committee forum. So that's testament to how informed they are and that they participate in the production of this paper as well as commentary on the production of the paper. I would like to introduce our speakers. I'm going to introduce them and then they'll one by one turn on their microphones and speakers as necessary. Before I do that, though, I just want to remind everyone, Q&A in the Q&A function. You're welcome to keep the chats going on the side. Oh, good morning from South Wales. That's interesting. And you are welcome to keep the chat going on the side. Just keep it polite, keep it about the topic and open to all other people's views. We are going to hear, our session today is going to be facilitated by Susan Tosh. Sue is a non-executive director of Standard Bank Global Services Limited. She's also an independent advisor to remuneration committees and companies on exec remuneration. We also have Lawrence Grubb. He's a master reward specialist and managing director at Cochela Remuneration Advisors, also an independent advisor to Remcos and companies on executive remuneration. Ntombi Langeroids is a non-executive director, and she serves on various JSE listed and non-JSE listed remuneration committees as both a member of the Remco Forum, and she chairs one or two as well. Peter Koornhof is one of the co-authors of this particular paper. He's an investment analyst at Allan Gray, and he also serves as a non-executive director of Allan Gray's investment services. So you can tell by their titles and their designations that they have got the knowledge that we need to discuss this, this topic. I'm going to hand over now to Sue, who's going to just briefly intro the topic, and then we're going to kick off with our first speaker after Sue. Thanks, Lawrence. If you want to just turn your camera off if you want, you're welcome to keep it on. But Sue, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Julie. And a very good morning to all the participants who bravely got up and then showed up for this webinar on this wintry morning in South Africa. And if you got up and you're still in the process of showing up, then it's just as well the cameras are off for participants. As Jules mentioned, I'm a member of the Remuneration Committee Forum, and we're planning on having a great discussion on some of the main players in the executive remuneration arena this morning. These players or principals sometimes find themselves in conflict, and that might be based on whose interests they represent, or it may just be that they have different information or expertise. We're planning on having Peter Koornhof give us a brief overview of the paper and his insight on the role of investment managers in the context of this topic. And then Lawrence Grubb will take over and talk about the topic from the aspect of remuneration consultants. And finally, Ntombi Langeroids will provide her view of how boards and non-executives are dealing and seeing these issues arise. I don't think there's a remuneration policy in South Africa that doesn't mention alignment with shareholders or alignment with its stakeholders. But this discussion is going to test how this alignment works or should work, or ask you if it works at all. Please note, if we talk about shareholders in the context of publicly listed companies, we mean the people that hold the shares and voting rights on those shares. We know that there's interested parties in the webinar today who may work for state-owned enterprises or non-profit organizations, and you have equally important stakeholders which may create principal agent problems related to remuneration in your organizations. So without further ado, let's dive into the topic with me handing over to Peter Koornhof, for an overview and his insights of the role of investment managers. Peter, over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Sue, and thanks so much everyone for joining us this morning. So I do think it's a very interesting topic, and it's obviously got a lot of relevance, not only for the executive remuneration landscape, but also for the governance landscape in South Africa more generally. So I think to start off with, a good point is to ask, okay, but what exactly is a principal agent problem? Maybe just Julie, if you could share the slides at this point, please. Great, thank you. And to explain a principal agent problem, it's actually, the relationship is actually quite simple. So whenever there's a principal, someone who appoints an agent to perform a task on their behalf, you have a principal agent problem. And that's, principal agent relationships have been with humanity for thousands of years, and they're very useful. So for example, if you have a legal matter and you're not a legal expert, you appoint a lawyer to represent you in court. And that agent, that lawyer, has the necessary skills and expertise to perform that task on your behalf. And that's great, right? You can see the value add from having a principal agent relationship. But it's not without its problems. And those problems most often arise when the agent doesn't act in the best interests of the principal. So for example, continuing with the example of the lawyer. So if, for example, you lose the initial court case, the lawyer always has an incentive to tell you to appeal, because the lawyer gets additional fees. And you as the principal, because you're not a legal expert, you're not well positioned to know whether you actually have a good case or not. And you can see there's immediately a conflict of interest, and there's immediately an asymmetry of information. And that's typically where the problems arise. And when the agent doesn't act in the best interests of the principal, we call it agency costs. And there's been a lot of thinking and research about how to minimize agency costs, because these principal agent relationships are so common. Okay, but so what does that have to do with public companies and executive remuneration? So if we go to the next slide, if you go back in time, historically, the owners of companies were also the people who managed the company on a day-to-day basis. However, society and commerce has evolved since then. So in the 1600s, you have the rise of public companies, and then eventually you have listed companies. And as legal and commercial frameworks have developed, you get to a point today where the shareholders of a company are most often not the people who manage it. So most companies today are publicly listed companies, if you split it by revenue. And that means that these companies have professional executives who manage the company on a day-to-day basis, but they're actually quite far removed from the owners of the company, the shareholders. This is very useful. So because you have these really skilled and these skilled individuals with a lot of experience and expertise, they're well positioned to create a lot of value in the company and to manage it, with due care and with a lot of skill. But it's not without its disadvantages. And the problem here is that these executives actually might not act in the best interest of shareholders. So they might use company resources for their own personal advantage instead of using it to look after shareholders. And it's also exacerbated again by this information asymmetry. So, shareholders are quite far removed from companies. So most shareholders today belong to pension funds, belong to retirement funds, and they're actually quite far removed from the companies which they actually own, where the executives are involved with the day-to-day management. And that means they're very well positioned to actually gain it. Now, tying this to executive remuneration really started in 1976 when two economists, Jensen and Meckling, published a very important paper. And what they did was they used this framework of principal-agent relationships and applied it to the management of public companies. And their main insight was, if you can make it in the personal selfish interests of executives to create value for the owners, to create value for shareholders, then you can minimize agency costs and you can go a long way towards addressing principal agent problems. So this was a major development, and it gave rise to the executive remuneration landscape as we know it today. But it hasn't proved to be a fail-safe or infallible method of trying to address this problem. And so today, despite all the developments in the executive remuneration field and governance developments, you still have a number of corporate failures caused by misalignment of incentives. And you'd be well familiar with a lot of those examples. Okay, but let's dive a bit more deeply into, okay, how does executive remuneration actually work as a solution here towards addressing principal agent problems at public companies? So the first step here is, as a board, when you appoint an executive to manage the company, it's very, very difficult to know whether the executive is intrinsically motivated or extrinsically motivated. What I mean by that is, you get some people, some executives, who will do a good job and try and create value for shareholders or for owners because they think it's the right thing to do, and they'll work hard because they enjoy working. But you get others who want to maximize the amount of money they make, and that's what drives them. And it's very difficult to know beforehand whether executive is being driven by this intrinsic motivation or is actually just trying to maximize the amount of money that they make. What exacerbates this then is that because the executive knows the business really well, because they're managing it day to day, and because the board and the shareholders are further removed, they're necessarily reliant on the executive to know how the company is doing, to know whether it's pursuing a sensible strategy or not. And that means executives are actually very well positioned to extract maximum value for themselves from managing the company, instead of maximizing shareholder value, the value for owners. And the idea here is, and this is really the crux of the matter, is that you can use executive remuneration as a mechanism to make it in the executive's personal self-interest to maximize shareholder value. And if you do that, then it doesn't matter whether the executive is intrinsically or extrinsically motivated. It doesn't really matter whether there's information asymmetry or conflicts of interest, because you're aligning the interests of the executive with that of shareholders, and that reduces the agency costs. That incentivizes the executive to maximize the value for shareholders over the long term. But immediately you can again see there are problems here. And the first one we spoke about is this asymmetry of information. And the problem there is, again, the board's reliant on executives to come up with what are good targets for performance pay. And there you can see, again, executives have an incentive to gain them. But it's also more complicated than that. And the problem is, how do you choose performance metrics? So do you want to reward executives for effort, or do you want to reward them for outcomes? And then the other problem is, how do you factor in the impact of external forces? So if market conditions deteriorate, that's not the executive's fault, but it still impacts their remuneration. So controlling for this impact of external factors is also actually very, very difficult. Target setting also is tough. And I guess the problem here is that, you often have situations where, it's very, very difficult to forecast long into the future how things are going to play out. And it's also very, very difficult to factor that into your targets. And then the other problem that ties to that is short-termism. So because it usually takes a very, very long time before the long-term consequences of actions and business decisions and strategy decisions become clear, it means it actually takes a very, very long time before you can see whether the executive has actually created value, whether they have actually maximized value for owners. And the problem here is the executive has an incentive to, try and extract as much value for themselves up front. And that results in this inherent conflict. So the conclusion then is executive remuneration, it isn't perfect, and it isn't a fail-safe way or infallible way of addressing these principal agent problems, but it is the best possible mechanism that we have available. And I think flowing from that is then, okay, so what principles can you follow? What guidelines are there to ensure that there are executive remuneration policies that are effective at aligning the interests of executives. And the key ones here are firstly, having a long-term focus, and the key here being that firstly, obviously, if an executive owns shares in the company that they manage, that provides a very direct alignment for shareholders. But the other point is that, having the biggest portion of the executive's remuneration vest based on long-term performance measures means that inherently you're aligning it more with shareholders. And there are various different instruments you can use. So you can use performance shares, you can use share options to get that. But the key point here being that you want to have executives have skin in the game, to have levels of share ownership or exposure to the share price, and thereby align it with the interests of shareholders. The second point here is having long performance periods. And as I mentioned, by doing that, you reduce the impact of noise, you reduce the impact of short-term factors, and it's only over the long term that it often becomes clear whether business decisions, strategic decisions have actually been prudent, have actually created value. And then the other point is that having longer term performance measures and vesting periods actually makes it more difficult to game it, because often you can kind of dress up the financials for a year or two, but it's very difficult to actually sustain it over the long term. The third consideration is having the right performance metrics and targets. So obviously for executives have an incentive to grow the company. And it's very good to have a growing company, but the problem is that growth might be value destructive. So you might be generating a return on capital that's below your cost of capital. And by having that growth, then you're actually destroying value. Or there might be vanity projects, or the executive has incentive to grow the business, because if you're managing a bigger business, then you can justify a bigger paycheck for yourself. But the problem is that it might not actually be maximizing returns. So there's a big need to have a balance between growth and return metrics. The second point is that it's important to have performance metrics and targets that are difficult to gain. So often in remuneration policies, you see executives get a bonus simply for disposing of a division. But that doesn't mean that they've maximized value. So it's important to actually think beforehand about, what does a good outcome and a bad outcome look like? And then to factor that in. So to think about, did they dispose of that business, in a reasonable time frame? And did they extract maximum value from exposing for that business? The other problem that often comes in here, and where it really is important to apply your mind, is when it comes to adjusted numbers. So a lot of companies report adjusted earnings or adjusted EBITDA as a performance metric. But the problem here is that it's often the executives who decide on what the adjustments are that are made to those numbers. They've obviously got an incentive to gain it, right? So it's important there to make sure in the remuneration policy that the adjustments are consistent from year to year, they're fair, they align with shareholders or owners, and that they're also transparent. The fourth point is Wallace of Clawback, and that's becoming an increasingly popular feature of remuneration policies. And the idea here is, it isn't a substitute for skin in the game. It isn't a substitute for executives having, large shareholdings, but it does guard against adverse outcomes, and it does allow the company to claw back remuneration if there are adverse outcomes. The fifth point is outside views. And what I mean by this is, as a board, as a Remco, you're heavily reliant on executives to firstly know and understand what's happening in the business, but also to set targets, because it's often based on budgeted numbers that executives prepare. And in that sense, you really are enthralled to heavily reliant on executives. But that doesn't mean that you can't, supplement that with outside views. And that could be talking to shareholders, it could be talking to external consultants, it could be looking at sell-side research reports, and using that to get a sense of, whether performance targets are actually sufficiently stretching or not. As you can think, this is obviously very, very complicated, and it's very tricky to do. And the Remco is in a difficult position because, you want to attract and retain talented executives, and you want to make sure they're motivated and incentivized, but you also don't want to give them a free pass. You don't want to pay them a lot of money for poor performance or for value destructive behavior. And so the last point really is then you really need Remco members that are skilled, that are experienced, that have a lot of integrity. And that's necessary in order for them to apply their judgment in a consistent way, in a transparent way, and in a fair way. Then lastly, just going to the last slide, there are two other factors that further complicate this. And the first one is that shareholders aren't actually the only principals in companies. And what I mean by that is if you look at King 4 and how the governance landscape has evolved and how thinking about companies has evolved, we've moved away from this Milton Friedman idea that doing what's best for shareholders is the only thing that matters. We're now in the triple context, which King 4 mentions. We're now looking at the 6 capitals, which King 4 mentions. And the point here is that shareholders aren't the only principals. So, increasingly, there's a consensus that the customers, the employees of a company, the society in which a company operates, the environment in which a company operates, are also important principles in their own right, and their needs and also need to be taken into account. So that's the one additional point that I think is worth mentioning. And then the second one is, unfortunately, today, there's actually a very, very long value chain to go from shareholders to executive directors. So shareholders today are typically, they belong to a retirement fund, and that retirement fund appoints investment managers to manage the fund on their behalf. So there you have the first principal agent problem. Secondly, those investment managers then appoint non-executive directors, so it appoints a board by virtue of their voting at company general meetings. So there's a second principal agent problem. And then it's the board that appoints the executives to manage the company on a day-to-day basis. So there's a third principal agent problem. So as you can see, in each step of the way, from shareholders to investment managers to the board to executive directors, you have additional principal agent relationships, and you have the potential for additional agency costs, for additional principal agent problems. And in order to address that, in order to fix those, or basically to mitigate those 3 steps, it really is important to have effective remuneration policies, because that's the only way that you can ensure that executives are incentivized to act in the best interests of shareholders. And you do that at a very high level by ensuring that if the company performs poorly, executives don't receive a lot of pay. And if the company performs well, executives receive higher performance pay. And that really is the crux of the matter. Okay, having gone through a recap of the paper, I just want to stress the role of investment managers here. So the role of investment managers in this context, when it comes to the management of public companies, when it comes to executive remuneration, the role that it plays on it, is firstly that investment managers have a duty towards shareholders, towards their investors, to act in their long-term best interests. And it's very important that investment managers always put that first. But that's not always, as simple, because you have a lot of investment funds who take a very short-term view. You have investment funds who might be short a company. So, it's a very complicated landscape where it's not as simple as just having long-term, long-only investment managers. But it is important that they bear in mind, the best interests of shareholders. Going then more specifically to executive remuneration, it's key that investment managers act as responsible owners. And so that means properly doing research and interrogating your remuneration policies, and doing that to ensure to get certainty that they are effective and aligning the incentives of executives with that of shareholders and other principals. So that's the first step. Second step is then voting their proxies at company shareholder meetings appropriately. So I think if you're just outsourcing it to an external service provider, I don't think you can say that you're fully applying your mind and being a responsible owner with due care. It's possible, but I do think there's a need really to apply your mind and do the necessary research. The other problem we often see with investment managers is there might be a big negative vote for a company's remuneration policy, but investment managers don't communicate that to the RemCo in question. And that creates a lot of problems because it's very difficult to expect the RemCo to improve the remuneration if shareholders aren't telling them what the problems are. So there really is an impetus for investment managers to clearly communicate with RemCos if they do vote against the remuneration policy. One, what the issues are. Two, what improvements they would need to see in order to vote in favor of it. And then I think the other onus on investment managers and the other role they have to play is they need to realize that RemCos are often in a very difficult position. So remuneration is a very complex matter. You have lots of different stakeholders that you have to balance as a RemCo. And it's important that investment managers bear that in mind. And they need to consider that, on the one hand, they have to be consistent from company to company. And they have to be transparent about why they vote the way they do. But on the other hand, all companies are different. So you can't just take a cookie cutter approach to remuneration. You really have to make sure that you understand what is the company's context, why is it structuring the REM the way it does to try and align, REM with the interests of shareholders, and then make an honest assessment of whether that's being done effectively. But you can't just have, blanket approvals or disapprovals without understanding the context of the company. You can't take a cookie cutter approach like that. That's it from my side. So I hope it's kind of helped you just give a quick recap on what the paper is about and what the crux of the matter is. And then also the role that investment managers have to play in this value chain, which you see on the slide. Thank you so much. Over to you, Lawrence.
Good morning, everyone. And thanks very much, Peter, for that introduction and for going over the paper. I'd like to just say that Peter was the main author of the paper, and I think it's an extremely well-written paper. Thanks very much, Peter. So what I'd like to do then is to talk about remuneration and how governance, the role of governance can be played by the advisors or the practitioners or consultants to organizations. And Julie, I don't know if you can, or Cindy, can you go to that first to my slide? So what I did was, instead of putting up a list of things, I decided to try and do a mind map, which I think hopefully will be able to stick in people's minds rather than a list. I'm normally the opposite. I normally always use lists, but I decided to use something different this time. So what I'd like to do then is, obviously at the center of all of this is the role that we can play. And I'd like to go up to the top left-hand side and talk there about what I think is one of the most critical aspects, is the Remuneration Committee and the chair, in particular of the Remuneration Committee. And I know Sheila Motsepe on the questions and answers put in there a statement about the need for a competent board to be able to make decisions and evaluate the situation of the company. And Sheila, you're absolutely right. And this really stretches as well to the Remuneration Committee. The chair is the most important person by a long shot normally in a Remuneration Committee. And one needs to make sure you have a very good relationship with the chair based on respect, mutual respect, and where you are able to, before the committee starts, meeting, have discussions weeks before when the pack is being put together about different aspects of what is being presented, and clear up any questions by going back to the executives or the remuneration person in the company to understand the logic and the reasons why certain things are being put forward. And that talks to the one just above that, where all relevant information needs to be included in the pack. Sometimes a request for a vote or a change is presented in the pack, but there's not sufficient information for the Remuneration Committee to properly decide on whether to vote yes or no against it. And that's very important then for the remuneration advisor or consultants to make sure that the right information is included in the pack. One doesn't want to have packs of 500 pages long, but certainly one can make sure that they are more concise, but that the real information that's needed is there. And if in doubt, you can always get more information. The skills, breadth, and depth of knowledge is very important as well, and the experience of the Remuneration Committee. And you need to be able to kind of gauge the level of that with each member and be able to complement the committee as a whole in terms of where they may need more assistance than others. Some people on the committee are better at financial measures, some people are better at remuneration, some are better at ethics or social and ethics aspects or governance issues. And one needs to be able to understand all of that and play your role properly in terms of what you need to do to support that committee. Preparation is always critical. You cannot, substitute preparation in any other way. You need to read through the pack 100% carefully. You need to understand the nuances of everything, what the objectives are, what the unintended consequences could be of any of the decisions that are being proposed, and look for anything that could be, and I don't want to use the word suspicious, but certainly out of kilter, out of line. Another aspect that one has to watch out for is this balance of power, and that is a very, very important thing. The CEO and CFO normally attend the RemCo as invited members. They're not members of the RemCo, but they're invited. And in some situations, you can find that the balance of power is very much in the hands of the CEO and or CFO. They've been with the company for a long, long time. They've grown the company from one size to something much, much bigger. And the Remuneration Committee can often be a bit scared to tackle some of the harsh decisions or that need to be challenged. And that's where the RemCo advisor can play a role by doing research beforehand, looking at comparator organizations, looking at the industry, looking at what else has happened to other companies in the countries of operation, etc., and be able to bring that to the chair and the Remuneration Committee so that they have that information available and they're not just arguing from a point of view of their own personal views, but rather from a factual point of view, and try and remove the conflict out of the discussion. So that's the side really from the Remuneration Committee. If we move over to the right-hand side, and this is very, very important in South Africa, one has to think about what is right for the company. You're not only looking at shareholders, you're not only looking at other stakeholders, but as Peter said, you're looking at the total stakeholders who are implicated or affected or influenced by the decisions of the company. And stakeholders are not homogeneous. You've got short-term investors who are really there for the next few dividends, and perhaps they see a spike in the share price. And so they're there just for the year, 2, maybe 3, to maximize what they can, and then they're out of that. And they're not really then interested in the long-term sustainability of the organization. And their votes will often go in favor of something that will make them more money in the shorter term. And there's a case in point at the moment. I'm not going to mention the companies where something like that is happening. There's also, on the other side, long-term shareholders who are there for the long-term sustainability of the organizations and tend to align more with the interests of the company because they want long-term sustainable growth and dividends that are sustainable, not to be there just for the short term. And then there's also the other agendas. And funny enough, there's a case in point at the moment, I don't know if you're aware, between Caxton and Impact, where Caxton owns 34% of Impact and voted against the fees for the non-executive directors because they want to take over Impact, but Impact are resisting. So Caxton voted against the fees for the non-executive directors, which means the non-executive directors will not get paid until this conflict is resolved. Funny enough, the non-executive has said they're prepared to carry on doing their job without being paid. one will have to see how long that lasts. But just an interesting case in point where you have other agendas that can influence the votes in the remuneration arena. If you go down, then Peter's already talked about the other stakeholders, the community, the employees, etc. And there's obviously often conflicts of interests there, once again, in all of these aspects. If we move down to the right-hand side at the bottom, we've got the fixed and variable pay for executives. And it's really important to get the balance right between the fixed and variable pay. And that also includes the short-term compared to the guaranteed and the long-term incentives compared to the guaranteed. If either of those ratios are out of kilter and the sum of the variable pay is too high, then the risk is increased because the executives then feel that they need to gain more to be able to earn more. And if that, variable pay ratio is too extreme, you can often encourage behavior that is not really conducive to the long-term sustainability of the organization. So that fixed variable pay ratio is crucial. Then down at the bottom, we've got the short-term incentives. Some companies do what's called a matching portion of the short-term incentive, which the vesting is delayed for 1, 2, or 3 years to try and balance out the short-term risk. My personal view is that you should rather use the long-term incentive for that purpose and keep the short-term focused on the annual objectives. And make sure that whatever you need to drive on the longer term is driven by long term, but that's a personal view. Malice and clawback are critical, and I know that Peter's touched on that already. Malice being where you can stop the payments or reduce the payments to the executives if a trigger event has occurred. A trigger event being something to do with fraud or misstatement of the reports or some sort of misbehavior that is detrimental to the organization. And basically then the Remco has a right to stop or reduce payments to the executives. And then clawback is where the money's already been paid to the executives and then the trigger event is discovered. And then it's a case of the Remco deciding whether to claim back from the executives, and if so, the procedure that they need to follow to be able to claw that money back. So if we move then to long-term incentives, and Peter touched on this as well, where we talk about the type of long-term incentives. And there are many types out there. The predominance, though, is very much more towards using what's conditional share performance schemes or full value equity settled performance schemes, effectively where participants are given a right to a share or the equivalent of a share, which will vest in, say, 2 or so more like 3 or 4 years' time, and the performance conditions or measures attached to the vesting. So if the company achieves certain levels of performance for various performance measures, then the quantum of the number of shares that will vest or rights that will vest increases. This is a great way and the most successful way at the moment that we have of trying to align executives' remuneration with shareholders' interests and stakeholder interests. Effectively, the performance measures are always a big challenge, and especially the targets, the thresholds, and the stretch where the person can earn the maximum. How do you set those for 3 years' time? You know, not so long ago, we were pre-COVID. Now we sort of coming out of COVID. We went through COVID. Now we're coming out of COVID. Or are we coming out of COVID? What is people are talking about a recession, global recession. All these sort of factors have to be considered, and some of them impact on industries more than others. So setting the right performance measures and the right targets is a huge challenge. And this is one of the biggest areas, I think, of where asymmetry of information plays a role. And certainly, once again, doing research into other industries, one looks at what other companies in the same industry are doing or have done. One tries to do as much research as possible into what the future of the economies that the companies play in. And one needs to then evaluate and try and discuss as openly as possible why those various targets and thresholds have been set. And where there's huge risk in terms of potential outcomes, then rather open up the gap between the threshold and the target and the stretch. So you don't make it very narrow, a very narrow band on both sides, because then it's very easy for the performance to either be below threshold and they get nothing, or above the stretch and then they get maximum. And that could be just due to misunderstanding the economy and the direction it's taking in 3 years' time. So rather, if you're unsure, open those gaps a little bit to make sure that you kind of fall within the range. Performance measures, I think Peter has touched on that. Certainly one needs to look at those very carefully. You need to understand what's appropriate for each industry. Different measures are appropriate for different industries. And yes, you want to choose measures that are not easily gained. And certainly I agree with Peter, avoiding the adjusted measures. That just creates another dimension of complication, which one doesn't want I don't think, consider. So yes, certainly selecting the right performance measures is a critical issue. So really, when it comes to the design of pay for executives, nothing beats experience and research into what can be done and how it should be done. And if you're not sure, get advice from other people. There's lots of other people out there who are experts or have lots of experience in these kind of things. And look at them and talk to them and see what they would recommend, and then discuss with your own Remco what you think is best. The last side then is the bottom left-hand side, where we talk about the executives themselves. And in this area, as Peter said, you get personal gain versus company interests. And in some cases, you get executives who are really in it for personal gain, and they will do whatever they can. And the favorite one that I always get is, or I'm sure most people in the space get, the CEO calls you in and says that he's very worried about his executives leaving the company and he needs to retain them. And one of the key things, obviously, is the more they get paid, the more he gets or she gets paid. So one has to be careful of that sort of thing, and certainly as a consultant or as an advisor. And one needs to, as you know, was discussed, look at the extrinsic versus the intrinsic interests of the executives, and try and understand that. And once again, nothing beats research in terms of making sure that you understand what is being done out there, what's reasonable, and modeling as well, and understanding what the implications are of an award. There have been a number of instances, that, you know, the last one being Sibanye-Stillwater, where I believe if proper modeling had been done when the award was originally made to Neil Froneman, that the scenario that resulted would have been seen as possible and should have been understood by the Remuneration Committee, and then the decision made. And if they still decide they want to do that, then that's fine. But then they must stand up to it when it hits the public in the media and take responsibility for it. Not allow the CEO to have to go out and bat for himself about his own remuneration. So I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned there. Minimum shareholding requirement is something that is almost a given now for listed companies, and certainly one should look at that as far as possible. Minimum shareholding requirement requires the CEO and the top executives to hold a certain multiple or percentage of their guaranteed pay in free shares, shares that they own with no restrictions, unrestricted shares. And often these are financed through the short-term incentives that are paid out. Typically, they have about 5 years to get to that minimum shareholding requirement. And so they use their short-term incentives that are paid out and their long-term incentives. When they vest, they either hold on to the shares in their own right, or they can use the shares to, at least the money that comes from the shares, to purchase more shares. And I think that it's tough on the executives, and one shouldn't really go overboard with the multiple that you want them to hold. But I do think it's a very good way of aligning interests. because you do have now the executives with skin in the game, real skin in the game, their own money that they now have to hold, and now they really do think like shareholders. Obviously, the length and measurement of vesting periods, also then all of these impact on the executive's cash flow. The longer the vesting periods, the more they have to hold in MSR, the more it affects their cash flow, the more it means that their investment portfolio is linked to the company in which they work. And to some extent, depending upon the life cycle of the executive, it might mean that that executive might have no other investments, because basically they're having to put everything they've got into the shares of the company to meet the MSR. And that can also be a bit unfair, I suppose, because now while the shareholders are able to diversify their portfolio and buy and sell as and when they want to, you've got the executive who's restricted and can only, will get given the shares at a certain time, whether they like it or not, and then they have to, and they vest at a certain time, whether it's, the market's in the right place and the company's in the right place or not. Whereas investors can buy and sell as and when they see fit. So one has to look at all of these items and try and balance them all as a remuneration advisor or consultant or practitioner. And certainly there is no easy, simple answer. There's no silver bullet. There is, I think, a need for a lot of experience, a lot of research, a lot of detailed analysis of each remuneration pack, really understanding it. In fact, as an advisor to the RemCo, you would also want to normally interact with the remuneration practitioners in the company to understand what's behind there, and if necessary, the CFO or CEO, so that you can understand, all the sides of the argument, and then be able to advise the RemCo, especially the chair, in terms of what you think is the most appropriate way to go, and what discussions to hold, even if you don't know the decision, at least the right questions to ask in those meetings. So that's all from my side, and I'd like to hand over then to my esteemed colleague and good friend, Ntombi Langeroids, who's going to take you through the rest of the presentations. Over to you, Ntombi.
Thank you, Lawrence, and thank you, Peter and Sue and everybody who put this together. It's very interesting listening to everybody and trying to sort of relate it to my own experience as a member of RemCo and as a member, as chair of some RemCos, and seeing, for me, the sort of glue that holds everything together is the fact that we're talking about people at the end of the day, right? All the things that we need to do around remuneration are related to people's behavior, the sense of responsibility, their obligations, their requirements, their needs, their wants, it's all about people. So for me, fundamentally, we need to say, do we understand people? So when we talk about skills in a remuneration committee, I would highly recommend having a person with human capital knowledge, experience, or inclination, because it makes it a lot easier. However, that's just my personal thought, initial personal thought. To get onto the paper itself, I think it's a very well-written paper. And I think that if you haven't had a chance to read it, please do, because it contextualizes a great understanding of the historical context. And I don't believe we can get any solutions unless we understand the historical context well, right? And even there, we speak about the behavioral challenges that occur because human beings respond to stimuli, right? So if the structure is such that you are expecting a certain kind of behavior, it will come up. So short-term incentives, whatever, malice and clawback, they precipitate a certain kind of behavior. And so, we need to be conscious of those things to allow ourselves to design and pattern what outcomes we wish to see or to have come out. So then, for me, one of the big questions is this not the time, perhaps, to be looking at a different model so that we drive different behavior? And maybe we'll get different agency costs. And maybe we'll get more responsible board members, Remco members, executive, right? We won't have the situations that some of my colleagues have already shared. So it's just a question. So also that means that maybe we need to look at alternative performance measures. And I think in my own little world that the conversation around ESG and being more responsible about the environment that we live in is asking us to do that, precisely that, to not only focus on the financial and not only focus on the me and what I get out of it and how I'm going to be better financially, or in that sense. I do, however, want to just put this on the table, that I think that we need far more than a remuneration policy and a framework to address the issue of appropriate behavior of individuals within companies and corporate spaces. I want to then just go a little bit into what the role of the board, non-executives, and Remco could be. So one of the big questions that Remcos need to deal with is how to incentivize and hold people accountable. And as I've just said in my introduction, I think it's difficult to do so without actually having some very robust and sincere conversations around how do we value contribution, for instance. And my experience has been, and other people may have different experiences, but there's a tendency to sort of think that the value of the CFO and CEO is greater than, for instance, the people officer, the investment officer, the IT executive, etc. And I stand to be corrected, but I'm just saying in terms of what I've seen in the 20 odd years that I've been involved in this space, there's that kind of thing. We tend to remunerate them better. We tend to look at them as scarce skills, etc. So perhaps what we need to be doing is having a better definition of the value of each portfolio on the executive table, right? And then be able to then look at how do we then incentivize these individuals. Then the next issue is, for me, how to act in the best interest of the company or shareholders. And this is a conversation that Peter gets involved in quite a lot. And I think he mentioned earlier that there's a new definition of who the owners are. And this is being developed. So we need to think differently. So shareholders, important, but not the only owners of a company. And we hear the word stakeholder coming up more and more. But the definition of stakeholders, who are the stakeholders and how much stake do they have in the business, is still being defined in my view. Remcos then have to do their best to balance the interests and the power dynamics of these differing, can we call them owners, and stakeholders, because they come with complicated requirements, what their needs are, what they want out of it, the kind of outcome they want to do, right? And we find that today shareholders are exceptionally powerful, right? And in fact, I think Lawrence shared their example of a company where now directors can't get fees, but it's not only the directors who can't get fees, the company is finding it difficult to perform, right? To actually try and get what they were out there to do because of this impasse between a shareholder, a shareholder, and the rest of the decision-making table. So I think that there may be need for changing those dynamics and the behavioral dynamics there. And some of the things that a Remco will have to do is to try and ensure that those challenges are dealt with in as fairly and in as balanced a fashion as is possible. And that's why the role of the independent NED becomes very important. And I mean, we can go into a long conversation around what does independence mean, because most of the time we're looking for people with experts, knowledge and experience in the company's widget making or whatever they do. And therefore, how independent can one be? But be that as it may, it does create a different kind of conversation when you have to then balance these challenges. The only way out of that, in my view, is that you have to make the opportunity for stakeholders to engage with the NEDs or the REMCO. Now, the practice has been that when we're about to go to an AGM or when we're going to make a change in the remuneration policy, we run around amongst the shareholders predominantly and talk to them about it. Of course, they've got differing views. Of course, they've got a different way of creating the kind of behaviors that they want, right? These may sometimes be in conflict with other shareholders and other stakeholders in the business. And so the role of the REMCO will be to balance that and come to somewhat, not a full agreement, but at least a tolerance level that can allow the company to operate and to meet the various needs. However, I've experienced quite often an apprehension from executives for non-executive directors to meet with shareholders or stakeholders, which makes it a little bit difficult. And often they use the excuses, no, it costs money, we have to take you there, you know, and time and all that sort of thing, and we pay you for your time and who. But I think as NEDs and as board directors, you have to find a way to engage with all the relevant stakeholders, at least at the very minimum, right? At the very minimum, at least once in a cycle, somehow, whether it is arranged by the company or not. But you need to make time so that you understand what their requirements are in terms of creating this balance. Right? Otherwise, when you start to look at, are the targets fair? Are they stretching enough? Is the LTI or the clawback, is the trigger the right trigger? You can't make those decisions in a balanced way or in a manner that is fully informed, right? So then the question arises is, how should boards think about other principles, customers and employees, as an example? Right? I believe that it's important that the balance needs to be changed. The question is how. And I don't have any ideas about how, except to say that we need to engage and encourage boards to engage independently of other stakeholders in a fashion that allows them the opportunity to have discourse in the conversation and to information share, right? But not as an inquiry or an investigation. I think that's what most executives fear, that board members, if engaging with other stakeholders, will then find out things that they shouldn't know. Because as I always say, the people who sit with me on boards always say, hear me say, that management's got 3 months or thereabouts to prepare their theoretical performance for board members. And board members spend, 10 days before the board meeting, looking at the papers and asking questions. For the rest of the time, they're not immersed in the business, so they don't really focus on it. Whereas, on the other hand, executives are immersed in the business and are there all the time. So they practice and they tell us, they just, basically, I've had the opportunity to say, oh, I know so-and-so is going to respond this way to this idea. And that's because they talk to each other and they know and they study us. And so they know how we're going to react, and therefore they tailor the theoretical performance accordingly. So I'm not going to go further than that on that issue, except to propose a couple of solutions to some of the thoughts that I've put on the table. And I'm saying I do believe very strongly that it is important that a space for discussion and engagement, which encourages a balance in the engagement, is potentially a very good space to start to remodel these engagements and the outcomes thereof. Right? And hence, such a forum like we are in today is excellent because, and I'm hoping we're going to have a lot of interaction with everybody so that we can start to develop new ways and new thinking around this kind of the engagement. I think that one of the things that pulls which should be put into that conversation is the issue around time, right? I think Peter referred to it as short-termism and the synchrony between what is the duration of the outcome of the project and the performance. and therefore the pay. What is the value, right, of all those things? And how do they link in? You know, because if you look at it, often executives are in a job permanently. So until they decide they're no longer going to be there, non-executives, you know, according to King, are in there for 9 years and maybe a little bit more. And of course, I know there are examples of people who've been in there longer than that. But, you know, there's a duration which is sort of set, which seems to be shorter than that of the executive, generally speaking. And then also the length of the project or the work that needs to be done, you know, and how does that all tie in terms of trying to create exactly what the output should be and whether in fact that output has been achieved and how much individuals, processes, etc., have contributed to that outcome. And I think that creates the crux of where the problems lie in terms of the principal and agent problem, because we don't as yet have foolproof systems and vehicles that can very clearly identify everything within this question. So where do we go? We need to talk more. We need to learn more. We need to train more. We need to encourage people to become NEDs and talk independently on these boards, and then create the discourse that we then need to help the thought leaders to design the necessary things that we need to get through. And I'm going to stop there and then open up for discussion and hand back over to Sue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ntombi, and thanks so much to Peter and to Lawrence for, I think, excellent, thought-provoking presentations. I've been reading the comments in the chat, and I've also been following the questions on the question and answer stream. And all of you are engaging around this topic with great vigor, I must say. So it's definitely, I think, hitting on some nerves and also hitting on a lot of support in terms of the information that's being shared. Just for all of you, before we go into the questions, if you go into the chat line, a number of times the link to the paper has been published in there. It's got capital letters saying principal agent problems and executive remuneration, and the link is below it. So you can pull the whole paper and save that for yourselves. But I think let me start off on some of the questions, because they started off coming in when Peter spoke, and then when Lawrence took over, and then finally on Ntombi's section. So let's get into the questions that you've asked. We've also got some other general questions that have come up and, you know, that we've considered or whatever during the course of developing these papers. So Peter, I think maybe the first question that came up in your section was somebody was asking what percentage of shareholding in a company would be seen as enough skin in the game. You know, we talked about executives having skin in the game and, you know, being shareholders themselves and following the share price, but what's enough in that sense?
Sure, thanks so much for the question, Sue. So I don't think it's the right way to think about it as what percentage of the company, because you obviously get very small companies and you get very big companies. So I think the principle is that you want it to be meaningful to the executive's net worth. And I think on the JSE, at least, best practice is kind of about 3 times the executive's annual base pay is a good kind of starting point. It's a good level. At which point you think, okay, that starts being material to the executive's net worth, and that should be enough to incentivize them. But you see a lot of variation. I mean, there's a UK listed company called Record Benkiza, where the minimum shareholding requirement is 42 times the company's, the executive's base pay. And obviously they have a number of years to get there, but what they want to say is we really want the executive to be heavily invested and heavily aligned. I don't think that's for everyone, but I think sort of 3 times base pay is probably a good starting point.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks. That's great guidelines, whatever, in answer to that question. Lawrence, you touched on malice and clawback in your presentation, and I think you explained the terms or whatever during the course of that presentation. But there have been a couple of questions of people saying, well, how do you go about putting in, a malice and clawback policy? As a remuneration consultant or whatever, how would you advise people to start looking at malice and clawback if they haven't got that in their REM policy now? You're on mute, Lawrence.
Sorry, I think it's a very good question. I think having drafted a few for companies before, I think the best thing to do is to start with research, to look at what other malice and clawback policies have in them, specifically the trigger events that are used to define when an event has taken place that should warrant malice or clawback. And then to put it together, draft a policy, but also make sure that before any decisions are made, that it's circulated to the executives who it's going to affect and the REMCO, and make sure there's proper discussions around it first, because it can be seen by executives as a huge threat to them if they don't understand it properly. And one needs to make them understand that this is not to take money away from them unnecessarily. It's if there is something that is severe that has affected the results that in terms of what they are either going to get or have got, that they understand that what those events are, and that it's not just an excuse for REMCO to take money away from them. Because in some organization, there's a lot of distrust between the Remuneration Committee and board and the executives. And that's a very unfortunate situation when that arises. And I think that's when the communication is broken down. And that's really, the responsibility of the REMCO and the board and the executives to find a way to get through that. And that's really when it's very difficult, and one needs to have proper communication and understanding. But just going back to malice, I saw somebody who asked about malice. Malice is when the shares or the short-term incentive hasn't vested yet. In other words, the people haven't actually been paid. Then you can apply malice, which is effectively to either reduce the amount of money they're going to get paid, or to in fact cancel it, all of it, depending upon the severity of the trigger event.
Sue, can I just comment there on malice and clawback? I think that earlier, understanding the context, right? And I think that our experience in South Africa has made us get to this point, right? Because when we didn't have the malice and clawback in place, we had all sorts of, what did we call them? Corporate events, I think, which occurred, which then made owners feel uncomfortable, right? And hence their voice was expressed through the investment managers, who then started saying, clawback, and goes back to our conversation around intrinsic and extrinsic investment of the individuals there, right? So again, it's we respond, or the universe responds to things that occur, right? And unfortunately, our experience has been that, in fact, executives have not behaved in, shall we say, a corporate manner, or a sustainable fashion. And so then so then there's a response in that way, right? And so when I often look at it, I say, what is it that companies can do in the event that we are in the process of finding out things that have happened? So we can make a decision, and I know Lawrence referred to a particular company. I'm not going to refer to any company wherein we have done something. We've agreed, because of the information we have at that point in time, what the future is going to look like, right? What I believe REMCOs require, right, is an opportunity to say things are not the way that we had thought they would be. Therefore, we can adjust. And I see clawback and malice as an opportunity to do that,
See, if I can just
Thanks, of course, yes.
If I can just comment, I think there are two things. So the one is, like, malice and clawback isn't like if performance is good and then subsequently it worsens, you take the money back. It really is a question of, has REM vested that wasn't supposed to vest in the first place, because there was misstated accounts or because there was fraud. So it really isn't a threat to executives. It's more of a way of saying, if REM was paid out that wasn't supposed to be paid out, as a company, you can get that back, and that's important. But the problem then is, by the time you're applying clawback and malice, you know, as a owner of the business, you've already lost your shares. There's already been fraud. The share prices have probably already collapsed. The company's probably already laying off employees. Customers are suffering. So you know, maybe at a psychological level, it is preventative. So it disincentivizes the executive from doing, you know, cooking the books or committing fraud. But it will only ever be implemented after the fact, and so it's not a substitute for, you know, skin in the game and other forms of incentives.
Thanks so much. The next there have been a couple of comments and questions around the mix of pay. And so people talking about, you know, you get guaranteed pay, you get some sort of short-term incentive or bonus or whatever for the annual results, and you have this shareholding, you know, this long-term incentive or whatever, and how that's constructed. So is there a right mix of pay? Peter, what would you be looking for at the top executive level in terms of those proportions? Lawrence, maybe if you want to, all three of you, I think, would probably maybe be able to comment on that. But let's start with Peter, move to Lawrence, and then turn Tombi on that.
Yeah, so I think firstly, it's important to distinguish that the mix would be very, very different for executives than for someone, say a middle manager or frontline staff. Specifically looking at executives, in my experience, the JSE is usually about a third between base pay, short-term incentives, long-term incentives. From a shareholder perspective, we think the more long-term, the better. And our argument would be one that better aligns it with shareholders, so it reduces the noise. Two, it better aligns it with other stakeholders, because you know, only if the company is doing well over the long term, it can only happen if it's looking after its employees, it's looking after its customers, it's looking after its suppliers. So we typically tend to encourage companies to go for 25% base, 25% short term, 50% long term, and we'd probably be supportive of even more long term if possible. But we do realize you have to balance that with the need to, you know, attract and retain executives, and they'd probably want to go for more short term.
Great. Thanks, Peter. Lawrence?
Sue, yeah, I think it's an interesting question, because one needs to look at what you're awarding, but also what the potential is at vesting. Because you might award, as Peter said, 25, 50, but you've got to look at what is the likely vesting that could happen based on the growth in share price, or the whatever metric it is to value the size of the organization, and also the potential vesting outcomes of the performance measures. But if we look at it purely from an award point of view, typically what we would like to say is that your short-term incentives should be target award at a 50% of your, this is at CEO level, 50% of your guaranteed package, and your long-term incentive at CEO level should be 70% of your guaranteed package. So we normally say 50 and 70 as a point of departure, but that does depend on the industry. Some industries have very conservative variable pay, and other industries have very aggressive variable pay. So one needs to also take that into account. And the level below at executives, you're probably talking more 40 in terms of short and long term, and going down to 30. So that definitely swings down, but your CEO and your top executives should be, as Peter said, heavily weighted towards your long-term incentive.
Thanks, Lawrence. I think that's an excellent market perspective in terms of, you know, the industries and etc. And also on the payout side. Your shareholders, you don't want them to be too surprised or whatever if a big payout comes out from those long-term incentives, that they should be expecting it because, you know, it was structured correctly.
Correct, yeah.
Thanks a lot for that. And Tombi, from your side?
I don't really have much to add except to emphasize the industry specifics, right? I think it's important to take that into account because in certain industries, the projects, the outcome is, it takes a long time, and the cycle, right? The business cycle, if I can put it that way, is much longer. Mining, for instance, industrials, they tend to take, their projects are long term, 10 years, 12 years. So that must link into that, right? Whereas in an IT space or a more vibrant space, it's shorter terms and it's quick turnarounds. So that must be taken into account. But I think the question that was asked is, what is the fair pay mix? I think from my perspective, I like to start with a balanced thing. So I'm one of those who says 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. Let's start with that. What industry are we in? And then adjust according to the industry that we're in, right? I think that it's important that when we do those reviews every 5 years, every 3 years, depending on what our advisors tell us, we must do it in terms of what is actually happening in the business and what we intend the strategy to achieve, so yeah.
Thanks. So I hope the audience has got some guidelines from that and a way forward to start looking at pay mix. So thank you for that contributions. I did mention in my introduction that we did have some state-owned enterprises with us today. And there was a question coming in from one of the state-owned enterprises to say that, how do you factor the sort of top remuneration when whatever particular unions was one example that was given. And so how do you reward in an SOE for something like that? How do you go about that? Maybe we can start with you, Lawrence.
Sorry, Sue, I don't think I got the full question. You went off for a while, so.
I apologize. I must have had a break in my transmission. I apologize for that. Let me reframe it. We've had a question from a state-owned enterprise and talking about how to reward the people who are driving some of these massive projects in state-owned enterprise and have big issues to deal with, for example, like unions on the side, work stoppages, etc. How would you reward somebody running a state-owned enterprise and running those big projects, being responsible for those, regarding some of the different ways work happens in a state-owned enterprise? And I think could we start with Lawrence? Was my connection okay?
Yes, Sue, thank you. I heard you that time. I was a bit worried the first time. I thought I don't quite know what I'm going to answer. But yeah, it's fine. To my mind, it can be very similar in many ways to what one would do in a listed company or private public company. There's no reason why one shouldn't be able to design a long-term incentive for the executives. There's ways of valuing organizations that one can use, some of them fairly simple, fairly easy, and one can bring in other measures as well to drive the right behavior and avoid unintended consequences, which is what one's trying to do. So between the short-term and the long-term incentive, one can drive the right kind of behaviors by creating and designing those which one can do for state-owned entities. And when it comes to state-owned entities, yes, they have got a lot of complexity in them because obviously you've got the government as a shareholder with all the consequences that brings. You've got unions which also have a big issue to play and many other factors which some state-owned entities have at the moment. But there are other state-owned entities that are well run and have proper governance in them, and they are being managed properly, and they do have long-term incentives and short-term incentives which drive and encourage the right behaviors. So it's not an impossible thing. And also in a private or listed company, public company, one needs to also understand there that they also have huge complexities. Normally they're fighting for market share. They're not in a monopoly in an organization. They're competing globally with other organizations. They've also got union issues. They've also got to raise capital. They don't have a shareholder who can just, provide more money from the taxpayer, all these kind of things. So It's not that one is more complicated than the other. They've got different factors and different situations that they need to consider. But I don't believe the remuneration structure needs to be that different.
Thanks, Lawrence. I think that's valuable advice for our state-owned enterprises. A question for you, Ntombi. Can you pay one of your top executives a discretionary bonus that's not in your remuneration policy?
I think that's dangerous practice. It's a dangerous practice. You know, I wouldn't do it as a Remco chair at all. I mean, I can't, off the top of my head, think of any reason why I would need to, you know, in a space where today everything is so, you know, we're going all the way around transparency and seeing. You certainly don't want to be explaining what your discretion was, you know, and what your reasoning was, you know. So simple answer, no, I wouldn't.
Sue, sorry, I saw another question just related to that, where somebody said, should you adjust the targets for vesting, for performance measures? And that is the worst thing to do. Don't ever, ever adjust a target. If you have to do something, then rather justify using the Remco's discretion and explain it very clearly and properly in the remuneration report as to how they've applied that discretion. But I would strongly, strongly avoid ever changing any targets or thresholds or max for any performance measure in any scheme.
Yeah, I think that this issue of discretion of the Remco, I think you raised a question earlier on about one company where this could have been a scenario. And I think that the discretion comes with using the knowledge that you have at hand, being conscious of the environment that you operate in, to say, maybe we should hold on a bit. We're not changing the target. We're not changing the outcome. We're just being sensitive to where we're at, right? And I think you mentioned this, the question where, you know, the incumbent or the recipient and company work together to form a solution that is appropriate for the environment in which we live, you know, because often, you know, with these long-term incentives, it's 5 years, it's 9 years sometimes, you know, so things can change drastically. I mean, who thought COVID was going to come around, you know, as an example. So yeah, so that's discretion is important, but not on an individual or thumbs-up basis, no.
Just as an example. Sorry, Peter, you go ahead.
No, it's fine, Lawrence, go, but I'll talk after you.
No, it's just an example of a company that I was advising, and with COVID hitting, what was done was that calculations were made around the cost of COVID in terms of what the company required to spend to minimize the impact of COVID on its employees, keep everyone safe and healthy, etc. And those calculations were done. The targets were not adjusted though. What was taken into account was, if we hadn't had to spend that kind of money, you know, what could have been the outcome? And then the Remco did apply some discretion, but it was also properly discussed and communicated with the major shareholders. And because there was a valid, logical, you know, sort of construct towards it, it was actually very well accepted.
So I think part of the problem with using discretion is the precedent it sets. So what we saw happen with a lot of companies is, you know, sometimes something external happens that's outside of the control of the executives, and then targets get adjusted downwards. But the precedent it then sets is that actually it doesn't really matter that much how you perform, because, you know, there's always going to be some kind of adjustment. You're still going to get paid regardless. So then, you know, the second and third order effects are, you know, performance pay stops being performance pay. On the other hand, you know, sometimes things happen, you know, war breaks out or COVID strikes. And there, I think, at least from a shareholder perspective, the way we think about it is symmetry is important. So where shareholders typically buy down REM policies is when COVID struck, targets were lowered, and maybe that's fair enough. But then if the economy rebounds quicker than people were expecting, I didn't see a lot of companies actually increase their targets because things turned out better than people were expecting. So I think that downwards and upwards symmetry in terms of adjusting for factors is important. And I guess the other thing is then, it's important to be transparent. So we have seen situations where Remcos say, listen, there was this exogenous crazy thing that happened and we had to adjust the Rem forward. But if you use discretion and you're transparent about it and you motivate it, you do give meaningful motivation for it in the Rem report or so, I think you're much more likely to get shareholder buy-in than if you just say, you know what, we used our discretion, that's it.
Thanks for that advice, Peter. Peter, while I've got you on the line, could I ask you another question just in terms of incentives? And there's a question that's come up in the question and answer line. And it's regarding at the top level, an executive, say a CEO, whatever, gets paid really good fixed pay, really good guaranteed pay, and then is going to get a short-term incentive for the year's annual results. But surely that's just doing their job. What differentiates for you what is like a short-term incentive, in inverted commas bonus, related to what the CEO is supposed to be doing?
Sure, that's a very difficult question, and I think it's a very good one, because you're getting paid a salary to do your job. So why do you need to get a bonus on top of that for doing your job? I think the key here is balance. So sometimes you do your job, but the outcomes don't come through. So it's a question of, are you rewarding effort versus are you rewarding output? So I think that's the one way of thinking about it. And then the other way is to say, well, there needs to be alignment of some sort. So if you just get fixed pay, then there isn't as much of an incentive to work those extra hours, or to apply your mind more judiciously in terms of making decisions. So there is definitely a room for short-term incentives and also for longer-term incentives, but there's overlap, and it varies, and there's interplay between them. And that's where, the need for having a good REM consultant, for having good, HR practitioners on the REMCO, and having good REMCO members is really important. And to have the dialogues with executives and understand where they're at and what behaviors the REM is driving.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And I guess if you were looking at a particular industry, say financial services, and you had two companies operating in the same environment, and one did exceptionally well in comparison to the other, in that same period, you would want to say, what were they doing that was right, almost in a way, and sort of, that they would deserve some sort of incentive or whatever around those issues. So in other words, outperforming your competitors or outperforming them, the general market. Lawrence, do you want to add anything to that?
No, Sue, I think there's two things that come to mind. One is, as you mentioned quite correctly, the relative measures in terms of comparing the organization against the other peers in the entity, in the group. I think that's a very good way of also setting targets to make sure that the executives are not just doing their job, but they're actually outperforming the competition. And the other way of doing it is also that one needs to look at the long-term goals of the organization and factor that in, or cascade that, or reduce it down to annual objectives in terms of how you're going to get to that strategy and achieve those goals. And that should require certain achievements every year to get there. And those goals and targets need to then align to the remuneration target. So you're not just rewarding on a year-by-year basis. You're looking at a longer-term view. And then also you need to look at the return on capital, or the return on your debt, or your borrowings, or your cost of debt, and make sure that that's sufficiently stretched, that the targets are sufficiently stretched so that your shareholders are getting the return for their investment that one would expect, and not just a budget that is set by executives. So these are the kind of things one needs to have to balance, yeah.
Great. Yeah, thanks for that, Lawrence. Lawrence, I think while I've got you still, on the line here, I think there's been a couple of questions about what's the best way to fund share schemes? And then another question that came in to say, when do you use phantom shares? When are they appropriate to use?
So, yeah, two good questions. Funding shares as well, certainly one needs to model and to understand what the awards are, how many awards or what the value of the award is to each participant, how many participants there are, and what the likely outcome is if of vesting at target and stretch or below. Without modeling, you can get yourself into huge troubles. One is you end up with cash flow problems in the organization because now you are required to settle and pay and settle in cash. You don't have the funds in the company to do that, or the cash that you have available now is being sucked up by settling the shares. And that's something you want to avoid. So you need to be able to certainly model scenarios going forward to see what the likely vesting is and make sure that the stretch and the targets are sufficient to be able to fund the incentive in that sense. One, from a cash flow point of view, and two, from a return to the investment, to the investor's perspective. So certainly my only answer to that is modeling and trying to look at scenarios about the future. Two is, and setting obviously the right measures, because if one uses too many measures that are not, if I can use the word, financially orientated, you could end up with a situation where 70% of the shares vest, but there's not sufficient financial performance, because you obviously want all these other things to happen. So one needs to make sure that if you don't have a funding mechanism as the primary driver, then have at least that as a underpin to be able to ensure that at least a certain level of financial performance is achieved for anything to vest. The other question, sorry, was around phantom shares. Now, phantom shares can be used in a private or listed company, in a state-owned entity. Effectively, the only difference is really that instead of you issuing shares or the rights to a share, you're issuing a unit which at the end of the day can be settled on in shares or in cash, in equity or in cash. And typically the RENCO has that decision at the end of the day. If you're a state-owned entity, it will obviously be settled in cash because you can't distribute shares. And lots of private companies that are owned by families, etc., they don't want dilution of their shareholding. So they would also want you to have a phantom share, as it's called, where effectively they allocate units, but when it's settled, they pay out in cash. So there's no, I think the real decision behind whether to have a unit scheme or not in many companies is around what the owners of the company would prefer, but also looking at the situation of the company. And there are certain tax and accounting benefits between a share scheme per se and a unit scheme or phantom scheme.
If I can just...
Peter, are there any do's and don'ts of share schemes that you want to talk about?
Yeah, so I guess I think Lawrence hit the nail on the head there. So on the one hand, shareholders obviously don't want to be diluted. But on the other hand, if you do use phantom shares, the problem is, because it's settled in cash, the default outcome is that executives don't build an interest in the company's shares over time. And so obviously, in line with the discussion we had, we think it's great if executives do build a shareholding. And therefore, what we usually recommend to companies is settle it in equity, so that the default outcome is that the executive accumulates shares in the company over time, but buy those shares on the market, because awarding those shares and having long-term incentives through performance shares or options, that is a real cost. It is a real remuneration cost to the company. And by buying those shares on the market in order to give them to the executive, you're making that cost real. You're making it a real cash cost instead of, you know, some funny accounting thing, which you know, it gets adjusted out when you look at the performance metrics.
And I think your solution there of purchasing in the market also sort of backs up what Lawrence was saying, because then you actually understand how much you are actually paying out for, you know, for that share scheme. So, you know, you manage those cash flows and you manage those hedgings and all the things that you would need to do related to that cost. So it brings it home in terms of it being a real cost. Thanks for that, Peter. And Tommy, there's been a question regarding how Remuneration Committee chairs actually bring sort of the whole committee together to a joint decision. And an example that was raised or whatever was that, you know, somebody who's really almost in a way disruptive in the meeting as a Remco member. We obviously don't want you to talk about any of the companies where you are Remco chair, but what would be your advice or whatever in terms of, as a Remco chair, whatever, how do you manage a Remco meeting? How do you come to a decision in a Remco?
Okay.
And bring everyone's views in?
Okay, this is where the human resources and human capital stuff comes in. It's all about facilitation skills. So you need to know, as a Remco chair, you need to know all your members, right? Similarly, the operatives, the management people know you, right? As a board, you as chairman of the Remco need to know all your colleagues. What I like to do is, if I know there's going to be a contentious discussion about something, because you know, obviously you've got different skills, you've got engineers in there, you've got accountants in there, and they're driven by different enablers. And if you want to then put forward a change of sorts or something that you believe that one of them is not going to be, you know, necessarily easily convinced, then I spend a bit of time with them beforehand, right? To say, this is what we're going to be presenting at the next cycle, because mind you, we meet once a quarter, right? Unless there's a special meeting requirement. Meet with them, say, this is what is the thinking. Have you got any thoughts, you know, comments, and go through that process. And if the conversation gets to be too technical, then I'll bring in the REM expert, either from the advisor side or from the company, and say, let's talk about it, let's pull it apart, let's put all these questions. And if there are certain questions which I do believe that would be beneficial for all committee members to be part of, then I say, please raise that question at the meeting, right? So that when we get to the meeting, everybody's got the benefit of learning about that aspect, right? But we don't have a chaotic meeting where we have one person going into a dialogue with the CEO or whoever they're cross-questioning, or the REMCO or the REM advisor, you know, or the management representative. So it is really, I think, about, you know, trying to, first of all, knowing the people that you're dealing with, right? Secondly, assessing whether at hand is one that can be worked through, right? Because the meeting is normally about 2 hours. You don't want to have REMCO meetings for 6 hours and days and days and days. It's just not worth it, right? You know, you'd rather come to the meeting to discuss the really salient stuff, you know, and anything else to do with outside the meeting, and come back to the meeting to confirm the outcomes, right? But you know, when you're dealing with people with differing skills, it's always interesting, if I can put it that way. It's different, yeah. So that's what it's about.
Thanks so much, Tom.
Sorry, we live in South Africa, so I don't have to make any explanations, but I don't know what happened to the electricity. You know, it just went off.
We're just glad that it allowed you to rejoin us. So thanks for coming back in when you could. Peter, this next question or whatever is one, I think, which a lot of companies would struggle for. Sometimes, you know, despite your best intent, etc., and all the processes you've gone through, hiring, etc., you get a senior member of the executive team, of the exco of the company, who is actually a square peg in a round hole. And that person has just got to go. That there's, you know, remedial action's been tried, everything's been tried, and eventually, the company's got to part ways with that individual. What are the do's and don'ts of a golden handshake? And maybe there is a don't golden handshake, but let's just see what is practical. What can a Remco do in the case where they're parting ways with a very senior person?
Okay, that's a very, very important question, and kind of what we've seen happen on the JSE is typically if there is a golden handshake, you're almost guaranteeing you're going to get a very big negative vote. I think the risk there is if as you say, the person is a square peg in a round hole, and performance hasn't been great. If you do then give them a golden handshake, then it sets a very dangerous precedent. So you kind of always have to think about, what's the precedent you're setting, what's the second and third order effects. And the problem there is, if you're the new executive coming in, then what you basically know is, I can do a pretty poor job for the next 5 years or for the next 3 years, and they're going to pay me a lot of money to go away. And then again, you're sitting with the problem that the rest of the remuneration policy loses its effectiveness as a way of incentivizing the right behavior. So it really does create moral hazard. It's a dangerous precedent. But sometimes it is in the best interest of the company to actually just get the person to leave, so you can get a good person in to turn things around and address it. But that is, if I'm being honest, that's quite a hard sell for shareholders. And it's also, it might be a hard sell for other execs who have been doing the right thing, who have been working hard to, contribute to the company, contribute to the culture. And now they see a person who's been destructive actually getting rewarded. I think that would be disincentivizing towards them. So I think in general, the point is don't. but if you are going to probably talk to shareholders and I guess the best outcome would be that you aren't in the position where you're contractually bound to give a golden handshake in the first place. That's where, having a good remuneration consultant like Lawrence, or a good Remco chair like Mtombi, they've been through a couple of cycles, they've seen it go pear-shaped before, they know the tricks of the trade. It's invaluable to have someone like that on board to look out for things like that. Because if you're new to the role, if you're a new Remco member, if you're a new Remco chair, that's probably the last thing you're thinking about is, if things go pear-shaped, what are the contractual obligations where you're sitting? People tend to not think about that until, the proverbial paw hits the fan.
Anything to add to that, Mtombi?
Yeah, I was going to say that, we underestimate the fact that people know when they're not doing well, right? Most know that I'm not doing well, right? And most of the people that we appoint as important executives are quite reasonable individuals, So have an individual conversation first and say, brother or sister, things aren't working right here. How do we resolve, and then ask the accountants to become creative, around that, So, golden handshakes, in my view, I'm not very keen on them, right? And I think that as Peter says, they don't actually they don't give the right messages, all around. And we mustn't forget what is left behind, right? Because then you have this whole historical perspective, and it's written down. People can read it. So even if they're not there, they can read about it, and then get further ideas. So it's actually better to sit and have an honest, robust conversation with the individual and say so. And it's hard. Constructive conversation is hard. But not asked to be leaders because we took the easy way out. And I can just leave it at that.
Great advice. I used to work for a company that had a field next door, and there was something like, let's go for a walk on the field together. But I think, and that you kind of knew that the news would not be good. But But anyway, Lawrence, have you got any practical sort of hints on that, on this problem?
Yeah, Sue, I think between Ntombi and Peter, they've touched on pretty much everything. I'd just like to share an example of what happened. It wasn't a bad executive. It was actually a very good executive who retired. And it ended up being a little bit of an early retirement for various reasons I don't want to go into. And what happened was contractually, because of his letter of appointment, which was many, many years ago, he was bound to be paid a farewell amount. And on top of that, because he agreed to go early because they had found somebody else to replace him quicker, they ended up having to pay him out till the end of his contract, and also the right proportion of his bonus, not pro rata. And everything that was done was actually correct. It was right for the company, because at the end of the day, the company got the new CEO that they wanted at the right time, who was able to move in and take the company forward. And to my mind, everything that was done was right, but obviously he received a greater than 25% no vote. Would we have done it again? Absolutely, yes, we would have. What would we have done different? We would have communicated far better to the shareholders in advance, and we would have explained it far better in the remuneration report. And I think that was the lesson we learned there. And that's where sometimes you do have conflict between shareholders and what is right for the company. And it's not an easy thing to do, but sometimes you've got to realize that you're going to have to take it on the nose, and you're going to end up with no vote, but it's right for the company.
Yeah, I think so. And I think you know, if you look at King 4 and the requirement to start sort of reporting on what terms and conditions or whatever you've got in the executive contracts, I think we're a lot wiser and older now in terms of, you know, the people who come in now in recent times or whatever, in terms of what goes into those contracts to begin with. But as you say, you know, you do have some of these historic things. So always a good idea to go back and have a look at, you know, the most senior contracts and make sure that you would understand before it happens or whatever, what you would do in an adverse situation. Yeah.
Maybe
thanks.
Sue, sorry, I thought Lawrence touched on something quite interesting there, which is, so what happens when a person retires? So do they get accelerated vesting on their incentives, or actually should you wait out and have those incentives vest over the originally agreed term and versus the originally agreed performance targets? And you know, what's the right thing to do there? Because we've seen some developments on that. So in the UK, for example, you're seeing more and more that if executives retire, that they have to retain some of their shares after retirement to ensure, you know, skin in the game. Because, you know, as you often know, exec leaves and the share prices are all-time high, and then new management comes in and they're like, oh, all these things are like broken. We've got such a difficult job to fix it all. They kitchen sink the whole thing. So it's kind of to guard against that a bit. So I don't know, maybe Lawrence and Ntombi, whether you have a particular view on that, or you two?
Yeah, if I can just add that. Sorry, there was one circle in my mind map that talked about post-employment risk, which I forgot to touch on. And Peter, you're absolutely right, and Sue. One should try to, you know, with any new contracts or any new policies, especially on LTIP, try and ensure that the executive who leaves for whatever reason, a good leaver, is sort of bound to retain their shares and let those vest over the natural course of what they would be vesting, rather than accelerated vesting. I don't believe in that. I think the shareholder, the executives, should be made to wait for their shares to vest as if they were still in the organization. And that allows them as well. It's another sort of avoidance of risk and trying to ensure good governance prior to retiring or leaving.
I think, Peter, you touched on a very, I like the idea of post-retirement sort of skin in the game, etc. But also it comes back to the issue that I raised earlier around the timeframes that we because they adjust, they move all the time. And I'm not sure that anybody, with the greatest, precision engineering abilities and accounting abilities, actuarial abilities can actually work it out, right? To the nth degree, right? So I think this is where the issue of discretion comes in, that, within certain parameters, that it should be allowed. But yeah, it's an interesting question. I don't think South Africa has yet got to the state of post-retirement, to the kind of level that the UK has. Right? But it's certainly something that we should consider. I mean, I know we're considering all sorts of other things from the UK and Australia, but maybe that's something we should.
I guess the other point is, as a chief executive, to my mind, one of your most important functions is ensuring that there's a good bench, ensuring there's a good executive team and someone to take over, that there is some depth in that. And if the day you retire, you just get accelerated vesting and sell off into the sunset, there isn't, you're kind of missing out on what I think is actually quite a very important part of the job, which is making sure your culture, the expertise that continues past your tenure.
That should definitely be in the scorecard of the executives. Around their own performance is what sort of succession plans have you got? Have you got a bench strength? You've got the developed talent that you need, etc. Peter, 100% agree with you.
Excellent point. There have been quite a few comments around the pay gap and obviously the proposed Companies Act amendments. We did have a session through the Institute or whatever on that. And Lawrence, there is a session that Sarah are running later this week, isn't there? On that. So I won't go into the pay gap now, but one of the questions that came out of one of those pay gap comments was the functioning of committees. And the person was asking, how do the Social and Ethics Committee kind of work with the Remuneration Committee on some of these issues? And I guess, if I were to expand that and take a bit of free rein here, there's other committees or whatever that remuneration should be quite close to, like the Risk Committee, for example. So maybe, and Tommy, you could give us just, how do these committees or whatever collaborate, talk across each other? How do they get information from one to the other? Is it through the membership? How do you go about it?
I think that it's very important that there's cross-pollination. So like, in terms of the composition of the committees, it's important to ensure that there are members who sit on other committees. So for instance, I'll take myself. I would sit on a REMCO and chair it, but I'd also be a member of a Social and Ethics Committee. I would also maybe be part of the Risk Committee, depending on what they require there. But I found that a very useful tool is to ask the company secretary to give access to all the packs for all the board members, right? So it doesn't matter whether I'm an audit member or not. I can read the pack, because you're right, there are things that flow over. And even for some of us who are not accounting kind of individuals, there's stuff that you read through and you say, that actually relates to that. That ethical issue in the risk area is something that social and ethics should be dealing with, not risk, et cetera, et cetera, and so it's important, I think, as a board that you have board members who sit on more than one committee, or sit on the board and then on more than one committee, so that you can share the information. Also, as board members, I don't see there's anything wrong with picking up a phone and asking your colleague, what do you think? What's your view? I've seen this, So there's the chatter that goes on behind the board meeting process, right? And then the board agenda traditionally will have a report back from each subcommittee at the board meeting itself. So that also helps to bring everybody up to speed. But I've also been, I'm not saying it happens at all companies. Most of the companies that I've sat on, we've tended to have all the subcommittee meetings very close to the board. So we would have a week for whatever that board is, So the Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, maybe subcommittee meetings that week. And then on the Friday, or the Monday, you have the board meeting. So it's very close, so that you are thinking about that company all the time, and you're able to then focus on energy. Unlike the other model where you have board meetings all over the place. And, for many of us as NEDs, we're sitting on 3 or 4 different boards, and you get the things mixed up, Yeah.
That's very practical advice. Thanks, Ntombi. That really is practical advice. I think that's all we've really got time for today. I cannot believe that 2 hours have just flown past, and the temperature's warmed up a bit. So probably time to release people from the seminar. But just from me and our panelists, Peter, Lawrence, and Ntombi, I'd really just thank you all so much. It's your participation in these seminars that make it so interesting, that bring things forward to the debate that maybe we haven't considered. And we've loved sharing this paper with you today, and look forward to the next Institute event. Julie, is there anything that you want to add before closing out?
I just want to thank you and our panelists very much for this great session. If there's any questions we haven't got to, we'll try and answer those some other way. And to please rate our event by scanning the QR code that's on this last slide and give us your feedback. We'd really appreciate it. Thank you very much.